Hey guys, tonight we trudge into the shadowed heart of medieval castles, those towering stone fortresses that loom over the land like silent, unblinking guardians, and sometimes silent, unblinking prisons. Picture yourself stepping through a massive oak door, iron-bound and groaning on its hinges, and immediately smelling the cold stone, the faint scent of smoke from nearby kitchens, and something that might be centuries of unwashed socks. Or perhaps something worse. You probably won't survive this, not literally, but just imagining the daily grind behind these walls might make you shiver. Castles weren't just impressive architectural feats. They were microcosms of power, control, and relentless social hierarchy. Lords and ladies lived on plush tapestries and polished floors, while everyone below might be scraping mud off boots, or if unlucky staring at the stone floor from a damp dungeon. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's fun imagining people across the globe tiptoeing through these same imagined halls. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing to understand is how imposing these castles were. Rising from hillsides or riverbanks, they dominated the landscape, signaling authority and, frankly, stay out unless you're invited, though invitations were rare. You trudge along a narrow path, hear the creak of drawbridges, and feel the oppressive weight of stone walls that have witnessed centuries of human ambition. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of this architecture was more for defense or pure intimidation. Imagine for a moment the peasants in the village below, craning their necks up at battlements, knowing that within these walls, decisions about their lives and deaths were made over roasted meats and strong wine. And it wasn't just practical. There is a fringe theory that certain castle layouts were designed to disorient intruders, almost like a medieval escape room with spikes. Spiral staircases curved clockwise to favor right-handed defenders swinging swords. Secret chambers held prisoners, who may never see sunlight again. And murder holes above gateways could douse attackers with boiling water, or occasionally wine, because yes, nobles were dramatic that way. You might laugh, but when you're facing a 20-foot wall with no ladder, humor is a luxury. The smell alone could be disarming. Smoke from kitchens mingled with refuse thrown from battlements, urine collected in rudimentary guardrobes, and the faint aroma of damp stone. Fringe accounts even mention crocodile dung sunscreen. Though most historians roll their eyes still, it is a vivid reminder that medieval life was experimental in ways we wouldn't dare try. You probably picture yourself lounging in a castle's great hall, imagining banquets and music. But behind the tapestries, away from the firelight, the daily grind could feel like a slow, invisible siege against sanity. And don't forget, while lords may have smiled over wine goblets, even they weren't immune to the darker side. Structural collapses, fires, and the occasional assassin lurking in shadows. You walk the halls, running your fingers along chill stone, and wonder at the ingenuity that built these marvels, yet also at the fear they enforced. Each stone is a story of ambition, paranoia, and control, and each arrow slit could have witnessed desperation as much as defense. By now, you're beginning to sense that castles weren't just homes, they were complex, often terrifying ecosystems where power, architecture, and human psychology intertwined. So as you stand in the imagined silence, let yourself feel the weight of these walls, the subtle menace lingering in every corridor, and the quiet tension that kept life, both noble and peasant, constantly on edge. Remember, we've only just begun. The dark side is just starting to unfold. You trudge further into the world of stone and shadow, and immediately you notice how the castle isn't just a fortress. It's a statement of dominance. The walls rise higher than any tree nearby, the towers casting long, sharp shadows over the village below. From this vantage point, The social hierarchy is glaringly obvious. The lord peers down from battlements, surveying every corner, while peasants scurry through muddy streets like ants around a giant rock. You probably won't survive a day under this constant scrutiny, not that anyone intended you to. Castles were not merely protective shells. They were instruments of social control, built to intimidate, restrict, and when necessary, imprison. And speaking of imprisonment, the term prison in a medieval castle isn't glamorous. Oubliettes, the dreaded forgotten places, were narrow vertical shafts designed for people who displeased the lord. You trudge down a narrow spiral staircase into the faint light, hearing the echoes of dripping water and the scurry of rats. Fringe accounts suggest some prisoners were dropped in wearing nothing but a leather hood, and meals were often shoved down through a trapdoor, leaving the unfortunate to dangle in darkness. Historians still argue whether the oubliette was primarily a psychological tool or simply a cost-effective holding cell. Either way, the message is clear: misbehave, and you might never see daylight again. Meanwhile, the castle's layout is a maze of intimidation. Spiral staircases twist in favor of defenders, murder holes above gateways wait silently, and arrow slits turn walls into deadly instruments. You might imagine an architect meticulously planning comfort, but evidence suggests the priority was fear. Some fringe theories even propose that certain wall angles amplified the sound of footsteps, creating an auditory hallucination of a much larger guard presence. So when you walk through these halls, imagine the echo of every footstep magnified, heightening anxiety and reinforcing obedience. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Lords often used the upper rooms and towers to entertain, to project power through lavish tapestries with hidden symbolism and feasts designed to awe visitors. Yet the contrast is striking. While the nobility lounged in warmth and light, below, serfs endured cramped quarters, stone floors, and a constant reminder of their insignificance. The stone itself becomes a metaphor for social stratification, immovable, cold, and unyielding. You run your fingers over the rough surfaces, feeling the weight of centuries of human hierarchy pressing down, and can almost hear whispered arguments over taxes, land rights, and grudges buried deeper than the foundations. Even mundane spaces reflected control. Kitchens were located strategically to serve the lords efficiently while keeping servants under watch. Water cisterns and latrines were monitored and used to maintain order. And yes, there's the quirky note that some lords kept exotic pets, monkeys or falcons, to flaunt status, while the common folk's only companions were rats and lice. You trudge along imagining a monkey perched on a parapet, screeching at peasants below. Historians still argue whether such display. You trudge into the outer defenses once more, where the interplay of walls, moats, and gates defines the final sense of security and danger. Castles were designed to be nearly impenetrable, but you probably won't survive imagining the relentless tension of living inside while enemies, disease, or structural failures threatened your survival. Historians still argue whether castles were truly as formidable as chroniclers claimed, or if their reputation was amplified by legend and rumor. The stone itself becomes both protector and potential killer, a silent participant in the daily struggle for life. Moats were both practical and intimidating. Filled with water or sharpened stakes, they discouraged attackers and channeled enemy movements into predictable paths. Fringe accounts describe some moats being home to disease-carrying animals, or even, occasionally, exotic creatures meant to awe visitors. You probably won't survive picturing a noble leaning over a wooden drawbridge, peering into a murky moat that conceals both hazards and perhaps a prankish rat or two. Even the act of crossing these defenses required awareness, skill, and a healthy respect for gravity. Drawbridges, gates, and portcullises served as both mechanical and psychological deterrents. A heavy gate could crush intruders or slow a surprise attack, yet miscalculations in construction or maintenance sometimes endangered residents themselves. Fringe tales describe lords accidentally trapping their own soldiers under collapsing portcullises during drills. Historians still argue how often such mishaps occurred versus being exaggerated by chroniclers to emphasize danger. You trudge past imagining the tension in every lift and drop of a gate, where a single misstep could mean injury or death. Battlements and arrow slits allow defenders to control angles of attack while remaining relatively safe, but the design also imposed limits and vulnerabilities. Fringe accounts mention defenders falling accidentally from narrow ledges or being injured by their own projectiles. You probably won't survive picturing archers balancing on stone edges, quivers in hand, acutely aware that the enemy ascend to the only threat. They must also navigate the very architecture meant to protect them. Historians still argue whether these defensive measures were optimized primarily for efficacy or intimidation. Even the aesthetic elements of outer defenses played a subtle role in psychological warfare. Towers, crenellations, and high walls signaled power and invincibility. Fringe tales describe gates adorned with grotesque carvings meant to frighten intruders, blending art with intimidation. You probably won't survive imagining the first glimpse of a castle from a distant stone spires, looming battlements and menacing faces daring anyone to challenge authority. The combination of structure, story, and spectacle created an environment where survival depended on vigilance, awareness, and sometimes sheer luck. So, as you trudge along the final walls, over bridges, and past towering gates, you sense the intricate balance between defense, fear, and human ingenuity. Castles were living machines, simultaneously protective, imposing, and dangerous. You've walked corridors, battlements, chapels, kitchens, and towers, and the threads of architecture, psychology, and human ambition have woven together a complex tapestry of medieval life. Survival was never guaranteed. Every stone, tool, and shadow played a role in shaping who lived, who thrived, and who became another whisper in the castle's history. You trudge into the upper towers now, where the wind whistles through battlements, and the view stretches for miles, both awe-inspiring and intimidating. Towers were not just lookouts. They were symbols of dominance and control, ensuring that anyone approaching the castle knew who ruled here. You probably won't survive imagining the precarious climbs up narrow, spiraling staircases, each step a potential misstep that could send you tumbling to the courtyard below. Historians still argue whether the dizzying architecture was designed primarily for defense or psychological intimidation of both attackers and residents. From these heights, the castle's layout reveals its calculated complexity. You trudge past parapets where archers once positioned themselves, imagining the tension as arrows flew in defensive volleys. Fringe accounts suggest that some towers included hidden chambers or secret escape routes, allowing lords and their families to disappear during emergencies. You probably won't survive picturing a noble slipping through a concealed door, leaving the rest of the household to scramble below. The interplay of visibility and concealment was central to medieval strategy, turning towers into both protective shelters and instruments of anxiety. Life in the towers was a delicate balance of utility and discomfort. Rooms were often drafty, poorly heated, and exposed to the elements, yet they were occupied constantly by guards, lookouts, and sometimes prisoners. Fringe tales describe sentries enduring freezing temperatures, wind-driven rain, or swarms of birds nesting in the eaves, all while maintaining vigilance. Historians still argue whether living conditions in upper towers were considered a privilege due to their security and status, or a punishment because of exposure and monotony. You trudge past imagining yourself wrapped in a threadbare cloak, scanning the horizon while the wind bites at your cheeks. Towers also functioned as symbols in the social psyche. Their height and visibility reinforced the lord's presence and dominance over the surrounding land. Fringe accounts suggest that illuminated towers at night served dual purposes, signaling allies and intimidating subjects. You probably won't survive thinking about how even a faint light on the battlements could inspire awe or fear miles away, demonstrating that castles were as much about perception as defense. Historians still argue whether such psychological tactics were intentional strategy or incidental consequence of architectural grandeur. Interestingly, some towers held unexpected luxuries. Upper chambers sometimes doubled as private studies, libraries, or even bedrooms, offering seclusion from the bustling life below. Fringe accounts describe lords enjoying quiet moments, reading illuminated manuscripts, or gazing across the countryside, aware that danger might lurk anywhere within or beyond the walls. You probably won't survive imagining this mix of solitude, surveillance, and subtle terror, how a single stone room could represent both safety and the precariousness of life in the castle. So, as you trudge along the winding stairs and narrow battlements, you feel the tension of height, exposure, and watchfulness. Towers are not merely architectural features. They are multifaceted instruments of strategy, psychology, and symbolism. You sense that life in the castle was a constant negotiation between vigilance, fear, and the fleeting moments of quiet control, where every step, every window, and every shadow could determine safety or disaster. You trudge into the storage and service areas now, where the lifeblood of the castle, its provisions, tools, and hidden supplies sits in shadowed corners. Castles were designed to endure sieges, but you probably won't survive imagining the immense planning required to keep dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people fed, clothed, and armed for weeks or months. Historians still argue whether the average lord overestimated their stores, or if meticulous record-keeping ensured relative stability during prolonged isolation. Cellars, granaries, and storerooms were a mix of practicality and hazard. You trudge past barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, and racks of preserved fruits, imagining the constant threat of spoilage, rodents, or damp. Fringe accounts suggest that some lords intentionally rotated supplies in elaborate rituals to prevent theft or decay, blending superstition with practical management. You probably want to survive, picturing a rat scuttling across a pile of oats while the steward nervously inspects the barrels, knowing that a single miscalculation could trigger starvation or unrest. Water supply was equally crucial. Wells, cisterns, and aqueducts provided drinking water, yet contamination was a constant threat. Fringe tales describe secret channels designed to flush out water for emergencies, though historians still argue whether such innovations were standard practice or exceptional ingenuity. You trudge past imagining the careful rationing of water during winter months or sieges, a silent yet omnipresent danger in daily life. Servants and laborers kept the castle operational, but their work was grueling and often overlooked. Hauling heavy barrels, maintaining fires, and ensuring that kitchens and stables ran smoothly created a ceaseless rhythm of labor. Fringe accounts mention hidden tunnels used by servants to move undetected, either to deliver supplies or to avoid punishment. You probably won. T survive picturing the invisible choreography of hundreds of workers maintaining the castle's complex ecosystem while under constant threat of accidents, disease, or lordly wrath. Even decorative storage carried psychological weight. Wine racks, ornamental chests, and hidden niches conveyed status while simultaneously serving practical purposes. Fringe accounts suggest that some lords employed secret compartments to hide valuables, sometimes layering treasures to confuse thieves or spies. Historians still argue whether such elaborate concealment was primarily practical, theatrical, or designed to intimidate. You trudge past imagining a guest stumbling upon a cleverly concealed cache, unaware that every polished chest or shadowed nook could hide both wealth and danger. So, as you trudge through these service areas, feel the tension between sustenance and survival. Every barrel, beam, and hidden compartment embodies centuries of preparation, human ingenuity, and the ever-present possibility of failure. The castle, in this sense, is a living organism, sustained by labor, foresight, and the constant management of both resources and human temperaments. You sense that life here depended as much on careful planning and vigilance as it did on strength and courage, making every step through these shadowed halls a negotiation with both practicality and peril. You trudge into the castle's armory now, where the smell of oil, iron, and leather mingles with dust in a strangely intoxicating way. Weapons were more than tools. They were symbols of power, control, and at times, terror. You probably won't survive imagining the sheer weight of chainmail, swords, and polearms stacked row upon row, waiting for the next conflict or rebellion. Historians still argue whether the most elaborate armories were primarily practical stockpiles or a form of intimidation designed to impress and overawe visitors. Armor itself was a paradox of protection and discomfort. You trudge past racks of plate and chain, noting dents, scratches, and repairs that tell stories of past battles. Fringe accounts describe suits so heavy that soldiers could barely climb stairs, yet they were expected to fight for hours under sun and rain. You probably won't survive picturing a knight collapsing after a single skirmish, more from exhaustion than enemy strikes. Medieval craftsmen prided themselves on intricate designs, often including engravings, gilding, or etchings that symbolized family, faith, or fear, beauty, and danger intertwined. Weapons storage also reflected social hierarchy. Nobles had access to the finest swords, crossbows, and daggers, while ordinary soldiers often relied on simpler, sometimes improvised tools. Fringe tales suggest that in some castles, guards were expected to decorate weapons with personal symbols, blurring lines between artistry and martial function. Historians still argue whether these embellishments served practical identification purposes or were largely ceremonial displays meant to boost morale and status. Training within castle walls was relentless. Courtyards and indoor halls doubled as practice areas, where recruits honed skills with arrows, lances, and swords. You trudge past imagining the clang of steel on steel, punctuated by the occasional groan or curse, as soldiers adapted to both weapon and environment. Mistakes could be costly. A misfired arrow could pierce a wall or a comrade. Fringe accounts even mention training injuries, memorialized in armory notes, underscoring that skill came at a tangible cost. Beyond combat, weapons also played a psychological role. Displayed prominently in halls or towers, they reminded both residents and visitors of the Lord's readiness to enforce rules or retaliate. You probably won to survive, considering the subtle intimidation a perfectly aligned rack of gleaming swords could instill, especially when paired with tales of past victories or infamous punishments. Historians still argue whether these displays were more effective than actual military action at maintaining obedience within the castle. So as you trudge past gleaming armor, stacks of spears, and racks of crossbows, feel the duality. Weapons are simultaneously protective, aesthetic, and terrifying. They are tools, art, and instruments of psychological control. The castle, in this sense, becomes both workshop and theater, where steel meets strategy, fear meets craftsmanship, and survival is measured as much by discipline as by skill. Every clang, every dent, every shadowed corner carries the weight of centuries of preparation, conflict, and careful orchestration, reminding you that within these walls, human ingenuity and human danger were inseparable companions. You trudge into the quietest part of the castle now, the chapels and religious spaces, where candlelight flickers across stone, and the scent of incense lingers faintly in the air. Religion was intertwined with every corner of castle life, but you probably won't survive realizing how fear often underpinned devotion. Chapels offered solace, yet they also reinforced social hierarchies, moral codes, and sometimes guilt that could be as heavy as iron chains. Historians still argue whether religious practice within castles primarily nurtured spirituality or was used to maintain order and obedience. The chapels themselves were elaborate, designed to impress and awe. Stained glass painted with saints, crucifixes carved with intricate detail, and vaulted ceilings that amplified every whispered prayer. This was power in stone and light. Fringe accounts suggest some chapels were deliberately labyrinthine, creating a slow, meditative journey that also subtly reminded worshippers of their place within the castle's hierarchy. You trudge past imagining yourself winding through the arches, each step echoing like the weight of expectation, as if the very architecture enforced piety and submission. Clergy played a dual role. Beyond leading services, they often acted as advisors, scribes, and sometimes even enforcers of moral law. Fringe reports claim that some priests would monitor conversations during confessionals for hints of rebellion or discontent, a kind of spiritual surveillance that blurred comfort with control. You probably want to survive, considering that a simple act of devotion might double as intelligence gathering for the Lord. Historians still argue how pervasive these practices were, and whether they were standard or opportunistic interventions. Rituals could be both comforting and intimidating. Bells, chants, and incense created a sensory environment that heightened emotional responses, subtly reminding everyone present that divine judgment was ever watchful. Fringe tales describe haunted chapels where shadows appeared to move independently of light, possibly due to architectural quirks, candle flicker, or echoes. Yet these phenomena reinforce the sense of omnipresence and spiritual scrutiny. You trudge past imagining how these spaces could calm or unnerve in equal measure, amplifying obedience and psychological pressure. Even daily routines reflected religious influence. Nobles often began mornings with prayers. You trudge into the inner chambers, where life behind the walls takes on a different, subtler danger. Women of the castle, noblewomen in particular, wielded influence quietly but effectively, often managing estates, supervising servants, and even directing defensive operations when the Lord was away. You probably won to survive, realizing just how much responsibility could fall on a woman who might also be navigating court intrigue, social expectation, and constant risk. Historians still argue whether their power was genuinely respected or mostly ceremonial, though evidence of women leading castle defenses suggests it was more than token authority. Daily life for noblewomen was a paradox of luxury and confinement. You trudge along corridors lined with tapestries, imagining the soft glow of candlelight, embroidered gowns brushing the stone floor, yet always aware of the subtle scrutiny around every corner. Fringe accounts describe women training in swordplay and archery to prepare for sieges, a practical necessity that contrasted with their delicate public personas. You probably want to survive the thought of a lady of the castle defending a tower with a crossbow while simultaneously managing her household accounts. Social isolation was another aspect of castle life. Noblewomen often spent hours in private chambers, overseeing estates via letters and messengers. The quiet could be suffocating, a psychological pressure compounded by awareness of lurking dangers, poison, betrayal, or simply the relentless hierarchy of medieval life. Fringe tales even hint at secret passageways used by women to move unseen, either to spy, escape, or discreetly influence court affairs. Historians still argue how widespread these practices were, versus being romanticized in later chronicles. Yet influence and danger went hand in hand. Women occasionally leveraged marriages, dowries, or alliances to strengthen their position or even to exact revenge. You trudge past imagining a noble woman in the hall, seemingly serene, while orchestrating complex social strategies that could decide the fates of neighbors or enemies. Some fringe accounts suggest women might have been involved in subtle poisoning plots, though historians caution that such stories may exaggerate their active participation in violent schemes. Education and skill were essential for survival. Women learned to read, write, and manage estates, and sometimes even acted as negotiators during tense standoffs. Yet this knowledge could not protect against the omnipresent threats of castle life, disease, structural failures, or social rivalries. You probably won't survive picturing a lady pacing a tower room, quill in hand, balancing her responsibilities. While outside, a siege could be unfolding, or a rival plotting her downfall. The interplay of autonomy and restriction defined the psychological experience. Noblewomen could exercise significant authority, yet every decision carried potential peril. You trudge along narrow passages, imagining how the air must have felt heavy with both expectation and subtle fear. They manage not only the household and servants, but also the invisible machinery of influence, using intellect, negotiation, and occasionally forced to navigate the dangerous microcosm of a medieval castle. In this way, the castle's walls were both protective and confining, shaping lives in complex, often contradictory ways. You trudge toward the great hall now, and the smells hit you differently. Roasted meats, spiced sauces, and the faint tang of fermentation. Castles were centers of both indulgence and scarcity, and you probably won. Tea survive imagining the stark contrast between banquet opulence and the grim reality for ordinary inhabitants. Lavish feasts could include dozens of courses, from pies stuffed with birds to platters of roasted game. Yet these extravagances masked the chronic shortages that plagued kitchens the rest of the year. Historians still argue whether these banquets were primarily displays of status or essential social glue to maintain loyalty among nobles and retainers. Recipes themselves could be bizarre by modern standards. You trudge past the kitchens, imagining a stew with ingredients that seem exotic, questionable, or even revolting to us now. Fringe accounts suggest some meals included dormice, pickled peacock, or spiced offal, combining practicality with a sense of theatricality. You probably want to survive, picturing guests trying to maintain decorum while staring suspiciously at the next plate of delicacies. The bizarre and unexpected nature of food added an element of tension to dining that went beyond simple sustenance. Preservation was a constant challenge. Salted meats, smoked fish, and root vegetables were staples, but spoilage could occur quickly in damp cellars. Fridges didn't exist, so storage required creativity and occasional luck. You trudge past imagining a cook nervously inspecting barrels of salted herring, knowing a single misstep could ruin weeks of preparation. Historians still argue how effective medieval preservation really was, especially in castles with fluctuating access to supplies during sieges or winter months. Feasts also served political and social purposes. Dining was a theater. Guests judged each other by appetite, table manners, and the ability to navigate subtle displays of power. Fringe tales suggest that some lords intentionally served unpalatable dishes to test loyalty, patience, or honesty, turning food into a psychological instrument. You probably won't survive. You trudge into the courtyard now, and the noise hits differently. The clash of iron, the whistling of arrows, the groan of catapults. Siege weapons were the medieval equivalent of horror movies in motion, designed not just to break walls, but to break morale. You probably want to survive, imagining being on the receiving end of a trebuchet stone crashing through a gate or worse, landing in the wrong place and hitting a friendly guard. Historians still argue whether the engineering feats of these machines were more impressive for precision or sheer destructive power. Either way, their presence added a chaotic soundtrack to castle life, even during drills or minor skirmishes. Walls and battlements were not immune to accidents either. Collapsing scaffolds, poorly maintained drawbridges, and overloaded parapets claimed victims, sometimes more than enemy attacks. Fringe reports describe friendly fire disasters, where boiling oil poured from the walls, unintentionally scalded the lord's own soldiers. You trudge past imagining a guard holding a shield while his comrade screams behind him, the chaos amplified by stone echoing endlessly. Even training exercises could be lethal. Inexperienced archers, slippery floors, and sharp weaponry turned routine drills into perilous ventures. Catapults, ballistae, and trebuchets were marvels of engineering, but precision was never guaranteed. A single miscalculation could send massive stones careening back into the castle itself. Fringe tales exaggerate instances where castles accidentally demolished their own towers during defensive experiments. You probably won't survive picturing the panic as allies scatter, realizing that their own fortifications are as dangerous as the enemy. Historians still argue whether most such mishaps were rare accidents or a frequent occupational hazard of medieval warfare. Defensive measures themselves could backfire. Boiling oil or water, designed to repel attackers, sometimes spilled down to harm friendly forces or even the Lord himself. Arrow slits that allowed defenders to fire safely also became death traps when enemy archers countered cleverly. The irony is tangible. Castles were meant to be sanctuaries of strength, yet the very tools designed for protection often contributed to human injury. You trudge along imagining soldiers dodging rocks and arrows while keeping a wary eye on their own parapets. Even beyond human error, nature played a role in accidental deaths. Rain could make stairs slick, frost could freeze battlements, and fire from torches could ignite thatched roofs. Fringe accounts even mention lightning striking catapults mid-battle, turning them into deadly projectiles. You probably won't survive, imagining a chain of cascading disasters. Stone, steel, fire, and water combining to punish the inattentive. Historians still argue whether medieval chroniclers exaggerated these accidents to highlight the dangers of defending castles, or whether daily mishaps were truly as frequent as described. So, as you trudge through the courtyard, imagine the tension. A single misstep could lead to injury or death, whether from mechanical genius or human error. Every stone, rope, and weapon is both a protector and a potential threat. Castles weren't just fortresses. They were high-risk workplaces where survival depended not only on skill, but also on luck. You sense the precariousness of life in this stone labyrinth, where the line between defense and disaster is razor-thin. You trudge into the inner chambers, where life behind the walls takes on a different, subtler danger. Women of the castle, noblewomen in particular, wielded influence, quietly but effectively, often managing estates, supervising servants, and even directing defensive operations when the lord was away. You probably won to survive, realizing just how much responsibility could fall on a woman who might also be navigating court intrigue, social expectation, and constant risk. Historians still argue whether their power was genuinely respected or mostly ceremonial, though evidence of women leading castle defenses suggests it was more than token authority. Daily life for noblewomen was a paradox of luxury and confinement. You trudge along corridors lined with tapestries, imagining the soft glow of candlelight, embroidered gowns brushing the stone floor, yet always aware of the subtle scrutiny around every corner. Fringe accounts describe women training in swordplay and archery to prepare for sieges, a practical necessity that contrasted with their delicate public personas. You probably want to survive the thought of a lady of the castle defending a tower with a crossbow while simultaneously managing her household accounts. Social isolation was another aspect of castle life. Noblewomen often spent hours in private chambers, overseeing estates via letters and messengers. The quiet could be suffocating, a psychological pressure compounded by awareness of lurking dangers, poison, betrayal, or simply the relentless hierarchy of medieval life. Fringe tales even hint at secret passageways used by women to move unseen, either to spy, escape, or discreetly influence court affairs. Historians still argue how widespread these practices were versus being romanticized in later chronicles. Yet influence and danger went hand in hand. Women occasionally leveraged marriages, dowries, or alliances to strengthen their position or even to exact revenge. You trudge past, imagining a noblewoman in the hall, seemingly serene, while orchestrating complex social strategies that could decide the fates of neighbors or enemies. Some fringe accounts suggest women might have been involved in subtle poisoning plots, though historians caution that such stories may exaggerate their active participation in violent schemes. Education and skill were essential for survival. Women learned to read, write, and manage estates, and sometimes even acted as negotiators during tense standoffs. Yet this knowledge could not protect against the omnipresent threats of castle life, disease, structural failures, or social rivalries. You probably won't survive picturing a lady pacing a tower room, quill in hand, balancing her responsibilities, while outside, a siege could be unfolding, or a rival plotting her downfall. The interplay of autonomy and restriction defined the psychological experience. Noble women could exercise. You trudge into the more clandestine corridors now, where the whispers of poison and court intrigue hang thicker than the candle smoke. Castles were not only strongholds. They were stages for subtle assassination, where ambition, jealousy, and fear mixed like ingredients in a deadly potion. You probably won't survive imagining a dinner where every bite could be your last. Historians still argue whether poisoning was a widespread practice or more of a literary trope amplified by scandal-loving chroniclers. Nonetheless, the presence of secret passages, concealed compartments, and clever containers made it frighteningly plausible that anyone, even a favored guest, could be at risk. Royal succession was often a delicate and deadly matter. A misstep in favor or a poorly timed insult could invite a carefully concealed vial of poison to your wine goblet. Fringe accounts describe perfumed gloves used to mask the smell of toxins, turning fashion into a potential weapon. You trudge along imagining a lord delicately sipping from a goblet, unaware that a rival's ingenuity might already be at work. It's a bizarre blend of etiquette and threat. You cannot trust the fruit, the bread, or even the air in a scented hall. Even the faintest scent of perfume could indicate either refinement or lethal intent. The kitchens themselves were no sanctuary. Stewards and cooks sometimes acted as silent players in these intrigues, either under threat or for bribes. Recipes occasionally included ingredients meant to be undetectable yet effective: herbs, mushrooms, or metallic powders. You might imagine someone mistaking a poisoned pie for dessert, only to find their life hanging by a thread and laugh nervously. Fringe tales even speak of cursed recipes, deliberately concocted to confuse or terrify guests before any toxin could act. Historians still argue whether these culinary manipulations were a common practice or largely sensationalized by storytellers with a taste for drama. But it wasn't always lethal. Poison had a reputation as a subtle tool for control. Some lords reportedly used it as leverage, threatening rivals with the possibility rather than the act itself. Secret compartments in furniture and walls could hide vials, jars, or powders, turning ordinary domestic objects into instruments of fear. You probably won't survive the thought that every ornate cup, embroidered napkin, or gilded box might conceal danger. Even ceremonial gloves, which seemed purely decorative, could carry more than fragrance. Politics in castles was as deadly as any siege. Rumors, alliances, and betrayals moved faster than arrows, and the architecture itself, hidden staircases, discreet balconies, and private chambers facilitated clandestine meetings. Fringe reports even describe nobles meeting in shadowed alcoves, exchanging poisoned gifts under the guise of diplomacy. You trudge past these imagined alcoves, thinking about how a single misstep in trust could change the course of a kingdom. Historians still argue whether tales of mass poisoning at royal banquets were exaggerated propaganda or grounded in genuine practices. So as you wander these stone halls, imagine the tension behind polite smiles and gentle clinking of goblets. You feel the weight of centuries of subtle threats, the quiet understanding that power in a castle was wielded not only by swords and siege engines, but by clever, mind-scented gloves and the terrifying uncertainty of who could be trusted. Every hall, staircase, and dining room is a potential stage for ambition, revenge, and survival. You trudge on, and now the castle feels alive in a different way. The shadows seem to move with a will of their own, and the walls whisper secrets you can almost hear if you listen closely. Ghosts, spirits, and lingering presences have haunted castles for centuries, though you probably won't survive thinking about some of the stories that emerged from these halls. Some legends claim that the cries of prisoners still echo through certain corridors, while fringe theories suggest that the architecture itself, with its tight corners and echoing chambers, amplified ordinary sounds into terrifying, ghostly wails. Historians still argue whether these haunting tales reflect actual spectral phenomena or collective psychological trauma among castle residents. Walk through the corridors at night, and you might notice the subtle differences in temperature, the way the air seems thicker near a corner or staircase. Some scholars believe this contributed to the perception of supernatural presence. Shadows cast by flickering torchlight stretch unnaturally along the stone, and your imagination does the rest. Fringe accounts even describe weeping stones, where moisture seeping through castle walls was mistaken for tears of spirits. You probably want to survive the idea that something as ordinary as condensation could give rise to centuries of ghost stories, each tale layered with human fear and superstition. Hauntings weren't limited to folklore. Psychological trauma played a real role. Children raised under strict regimes, prisoners left in dark dungeons, and servants constantly aware of the Lord's judgment all contributed to a shared sense of anxiety and dread. The castle's design amplified this. Long hallways, hidden staircases, and echoing chambers could make ordinary sounds appear sinister. Fringe theories even suggest that some lords deliberately encouraged ghost stories to keep servants and visitors obedient, proving that fear, like architecture, could be wielded as a tool. Historians still argue whether castles intentionally employed psychological manipulation through legends or whether such effects were incidental. Certain rooms were infamous for their unsettling reputations. A cold, unused chamber might be avoided simply because previous occupants claimed to hear whispers, and visitors would follow suit. Even the noble families sometimes reported inexplicable occurrences: chairs moving, doors creaking without wind, or distant footsteps when the halls were empty. You trudge past these spaces, imagining the faintest noise amplified in your mind, turning ordinary human activity into supernatural warning signs. Fringe stories abound. A hidden grave discovered behind a tapestry, the spirit of a spurned servant wandering the halls, or spectral knights marching silently across battlements. Yet not all hauntings were terrifying. You trudge onward, and now you feel it, the creeping tension of a castle under siege. Imagine the gates slammed shut, the drawbridge raised, and the village outside engulfed in chaos. Smoke curls from thatched roofs, and somewhere, a horn sounds a warning that can't be ignored. Life during a siege was far from the romanticized battle scenes in movies. You probably won't survive imagining the reality. Starvation gnaws at everyone. The air is thick with disease, and rats, yes, rats become both scavengers and a living reminder of vulnerability. Historians still argue whether defenders or attackers endured greater suffering, though it's clear that both camps experienced relentless stress, fear, and uncertainty. Inside the walls, the atmosphere is claustrophobic. You trudge through narrow corridors, feeling the vibrations from catapults striking stone, the shouts of men rushing to reinforce gates. Fringe accounts tell of defenders using strange psychological tactics, like dangling carcasses over walls to demoralize attackers. It sounds theatrical, but in a world without email or social media, drama was a form of warfare. And yet, amid this chaos, there were moments of ingenuity. Women would boil water or oil to repel climbing assailants, and men sharpened stakes hidden just beneath the mud outside the walls. You might chuckle imagining a boiling oil day, but consider that spilling hot liquid from 20 feet up, tea exactly safe for anyone on the receiving end, including the occasional misfired guard. Rations during sieges were grim. Bread hardened into almost stone-like consistency. Salted meat teetered on the edge of decay, and water, if available, was often stagnant and foul. And noble lords sometimes had stockpiles that could last months, while servants, soldiers, and unfortunate prisoners struggled to survive day by day. Historians still argue whether rationing systems were deliberately cruel or just brutally efficient. Fringe tales even suggest that in extreme cases, nobles occasionally resorted to exotic, preserved meats. That included things we would consider unpalatable today. Think pickled peacock or spiced dormice. You trudge past these images, nose wrinkling at the thought, realizing that a siege could turn even the most loyal servant into a schemer desperate for a scrap of bread. Disease was another silent assailant. Lice, dysentery, and smallpox could spread faster than any invading army, and the stench of unwashed bodies only exacerbated fear and discomfort. Quarantine wasn't exactly a concept in medieval medicine, so infection often ran rampant, weakening both soldiers and civilians. Fringe reports even claim some lords would isolate contagious prisoners in dungeon-like rooms with little air, inadvertently creating biological time bombs within their own walls. You probably won't survive the thought of being trapped in a castle, under siege for weeks on end, surrounded by the stench of desperation and fear, knowing your chances of emerging unscathed are slim. Even entertainment didn't stop. Minstrels and jesters sometimes performed to keep morale afloat, their cheerful tunes echoing eerily across battlements as people fought off hunger, fatigue, and anxiety. It's a strange image. A lute playing while walls shake under enemy assault, laughter tinged with unease. Historians still argue whether morale-boosting performers actually improved survival rates or merely provided temporary distraction from the grim reality. Yet, in this moment, you can almost hear the notes bouncing off stone, mingling with the screams of the injured, the barking of dogs, and the ceaseless clatter of weapons. So you trudge along, imagining the claustrophobic heat of crowded halls, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the constant vigilance required to survive. Every glance from the battlements is both a comfort and a reminder. Your life, even momentarily safe, is fragile. The siege doesn't just test strength or courage, it tests patience, sanity, and the human capacity to endure relentless discomfort, all within the unforgiving architecture of a stone fortress designed to keep both enemies and residents in line. You trudge deeper into the dim corridors, where the castle's hidden chambers whisper secrets of pain and fear. Dungeon designs were not accidental. Architects meticulously planned spaces to intimidate and control. Oubliettes, chains dangling from ceilings, and narrow rooms with barely enough air to breathe were the standard. You probably won't survive the thought of spending even a single night in one. Historians still argue whether some of these dungeons were primarily for punishment or served more as temporary holding cells for political prisoners. The psychological weight of being enclosed in cold, damp stone was arguably as effective as any physical torture. Torture tools lurked in shadowed armories, each crafted with a blend of engineering precision and macabre artistry. From iron gauntlets designed to crush fingers to devices meant to stretch the body incrementally, the range of instruments is both horrifying and fascinating. Fringe reports suggest some tools were purely theatrical, designed to frighten rather than inflict actual injury. You trudge past racks of rusty metal, imagining the subtle psychological terror a mere display could instill. Even the echo of chains clanging against stone could unnerve a prisoner, letting fear do the work that violence might otherwise require. Corridors often led to rooms with bizarre geometries, almost as if the castle itself was playing tricks on your mind. Spiral staircases turned defenders' advantages into disorientation for intruders, while hidden chambers created an unsettling feeling of uncertainty. Some historians believe these convoluted layouts served dual purposes: military efficiency and psychological manipulation. Fringe architects' notes, surviving in scattered manuscripts, hint that the average lord enjoyed adding mysterious corners simply to unsettle visitors, proving that even architecture had a dark sense of humor. You probably won't survive the idea that every door, slit, and shadow might conceal both danger and human cruelty. But not all dungeons were for punishment. Some were temporary holding areas, and occasionally they served as storage for perishable goods, wine, or even treasure. This duality made the castle feel alive, constantly shifting between safety, threat, and practical utility. Imagine a room that might contain your next meal or your next nightmare. Historians still argue whether certain infamous torture chambers were exaggerated by later chroniclers to enhance a castle's reputation for cruelty. Fringe folklore adds gruesome color. Whispers of prisoners who were trapped behind invisible walls or chained in ways that made escape psychologically impossible, even if physically feasible. Even day-to-day life near these dungeons carried reminders of their presence. Servants and guards became accustomed to the